In 1995, Border Patrol agent Rachel Cooper vanished without a trace during a routine patrol in the Arizona desert. Officially labeled a desertion, her case was buried in forgotten files until 15 years later, when a devastating earthquake exposed a metal container hidden deep in an abandoned well. Inside, investigators discovered Rachel's service weapon and her personal journal, pages filled with explosive evidence of corruption reaching the highest levels of law enforcement. What Rachel had uncovered was so dangerous that powerful people were willing to kill to keep it buried forever. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will thrill your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly under the scorching afternoon sun, its silence broken only by the occasional whisper of wind through scattered Joshua trees. 15 years had passed since Border Patrol agent Rachel Cooper vanished without a trace in this unforgiving landscape. Her disappearance officially classified as desertion, a conclusion that left her family shattered and her reputation in ruins. The case files had gathered dust in forgotten corners of government offices, another unsolved mystery swallowed by bureaucratic indifference. On this particular day in late September 2010, the Earth itself would resurrect the buried truth. A moderate earthquake, registering 4.2 on the Richter scale, rippled through the remote Sonoran Desert region, sending tremors through ancient rock formations and disturbing the carefully hidden secrets beneath the sand. The seismic activity, while barely noticeable to most residents of nearby Tucson, proved catastrophic for a long-abandoned well that had remained concealed for decades beneath layers of desert debris and tumbleweeds. The morning after the earthquake, Department of Homeland Security surveillance drones conducting routine border monitoring detected an unusual geological formation approximately 30 miles southeast of the Lukeville port of entry. Satellite imagery revealed what appeared to be a fresh sinkhole, its jagged edges suggesting recent structural collapse. The anomaly warranted immediate investigation, as any change in the terrain could potentially affect border security operations or reveal previously unknown smuggling routes. Commander Elias Beck, a weathered veteran of border enforcement with steel-gray eyes and a perpetually stern expression, received the preliminary report at 800 hours. His calloused fingers drummed against the metal surface of his field desk as he studied the aerial photographs, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Something about the location stirred a deeply buried unease in his chest, a feeling he quickly suppressed beneath years of practiced authority. Beck had built his career on maintaining absolute control over information, and this unexpected development threatened to disrupt the carefully constructed narrative he had spent 15 years protecting. By 1100 hours, Beck's team had assembled at the coordinates. The convoy consisted of 3 black suburban vehicles, their tinted windows reflecting the harsh desert sun like obsidian mirrors. The team included 6 seasoned agents, each equipped with standard excavation tools, metal detectors, and forensic collection equipment. The drive to the site had been conducted in tense silence, with only the steady hum of air conditioning and the crunch of tires on gravel breaking the oppressive quiet. The sinkhole appeared even more dramatic in person than in the satellite images. What had once been solid ground now gaped open like a wound in the earth, approximately 12 feet in diameter and 15 feet deep. The collapsed well's ancient stone walls were partially visible, their surfaces darkened by decades of moisture and mineral deposits. Scattered around the perimeter lay chunks of concrete and rusted metal that had once formed a protective cover, now fractured and displaced by the earthquake's violent force. Agent Martinez, a compact man with nervous energy and perpetually shifting eyes, was the first to rappel into the excavation site. His tactical boots found purchase on the uneven stone walls as he descended slowly, his helmet-mounted LED illuminating the shadowy depths below. The air grew cooler and more humid with each foot of descent, carrying the musty scent of underground water and decades of accumulated sediment. At the bottom of the well, Martinez's light beams swept across an extraordinary sight. Partially embedded in a mound of sandy debris sat a rectangular metal container, approximately the size of a large toolbox, its surface tarnished but remarkably intact. The container appeared to have been deliberately placed rather than accidentally dropped, positioned against the well's eastern wall, where it would remain protected from the elements and casual discovery. Beck's voice crackled through Martinez's radio headset, demanding immediate updates on the findings. The commander's tone carried an edge of barely controlled tension that Martinez had learned to recognize after years of service under Beck's leadership. There was something different about Beck today, a restless energy that seemed to radiate from him like heat from asphalt. The extraction of the metal container required careful coordination. Using a pulley system hastily assembled at ground level, the team slowly raised their mysterious discovery from the depths of the collapsed well. Beck's hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he watched the container emerge into the blazing afternoon sunlight, its surface covered in a fine layer of desert dust that had somehow found its way into the sealed environment below. The container bore no identifying marks or labels, but its construction suggested military or government origin. Heavy-duty hinges and a reinforced locking mechanism indicated that whatever lay inside had been considered valuable enough to merit such protection. Beck ordered his team to establish a secure perimeter, while he personally examined the discovery, his authoritative demeanor masking the growing anxiety that gnawed at his stomach like acid. With latex gloves and the methodical precision of someone accustomed to handling evidence, Beck manipulated the container's locking mechanism. The metal had corroded slightly over the years, but the seal remained intact, suggesting that the contents had been protected from moisture and contamination. The lock yielded with a sharp, metallic click that seemed unnaturally loud in the desert silence. Inside, wrapped in moisture-resistant plastic, lay two items that would shatter Beck's carefully maintained world. The first was a standard-issue Glock 22 service pistol, its serial number clearly visible and traceable through federal databases. The weapon's condition suggested careful storage rather than abandonment, with no signs of rust or environmental damage that would be expected from 15 years of desert exposure. The second item proved far more dangerous than any weapon. Rachel Cooper's personal field notebook lay beneath the pistol, its leather cover still supple despite the years of concealment. The journal contained meticulous handwritten observations, sketches of suspicious activities, license plate numbers, and most damaging of all, detailed accusations against high-ranking officials within the Border Patrol organization. Page after page documented a sophisticated human trafficking operation that reached into the highest levels of Border Security Administration. Beck's face drained of color as he recognized the implications of the discovery. His hands shook as he flipped through pages of evidence that could destroy not only his career, but potentially result in life imprisonment. The journal contained photographs, witness statements, and financial records that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning multiple government agencies. Rachel Cooper had been far more thorough in her investigation than anyone had realized. The commander's mind raced through potential damage control scenarios. His team of agents stood nearby, their faces showing professional curiosity mixed with growing concern at their leader's obvious distress. Beck realized that he needed to act quickly to contain this discovery before word leaked to higher authorities who might not share his vested interest in keeping the truth buried. However, Beck's efforts to suppress the discovery would prove insufficient. Despite his attempts to classify the findings and limit access to the evidence, information about the discovery reached sympathetic ears within the Department of Justice. A brief mention in a routine interdepartmental report caught the attention of Dana Sutton, a former Border Patrol agent who had transitioned to the DOJ's Internal Affairs Division following her own disillusionment with agency politics and corruption. Dana had always harbored suspicions about Rachel Cooper's disappearance. The official desertion ruling had never satisfied her analytical mind, particularly given Rachel's exemplary service record and strong family ties. When whispers of the desert discovery reached her desk, Dana felt a familiar surge of determination that had driven her throughout her law enforcement career. She understood instinctively that this development represented an opportunity to finally uncover the truth about what had happened to her former colleague. The stage was now set for a confrontation 15 years in the making, as buried secrets emerged from the Arizona desert to challenge the powerful forces that had worked so hard to keep them hidden forever. Dana Sutton's hands trembled slightly as she carefully opened Rachel Cooper's leather-bound field notebook for the first time. The fluorescent lights of the secure DOJ evidence room cast harsh shadows across the pages, creating an almost reverent atmosphere as she began her examination of what would prove to be the most important evidence in her career. The journal's pages had been preserved remarkably well despite 15 years buried in the Arizona desert, the plastic wrapping having protected the delicate paper from moisture and decay. The notebook measured approximately 6 by 9 inches, its brown leather cover worn smooth from constant handling. Rachel's name was embossed in small gold letters on the front cover, now slightly faded but still legible. Dana ran her fingers across the inscription, feeling a profound connection to the missing agent whose dedication to justice had ultimately cost her everything. The weight of the journal in her hands seemed disproportionate to its physical mass, heavy with the burden of truth it contained. Dana opened to the first page, dated March 15, 1995, just 2 months before Rachel's disappearance. The handwriting was precise and methodical, revealing Rachel's meticulous nature and professional training. Each entry was dated and time-stamped, suggesting that Rachel had maintained strict documentation protocols even in her personal investigations. The ink had faded slightly but remained clearly readable, each word a testament to Rachel's commitment to uncovering the truth. The initial entries appeared routine, documenting standard patrol activities along the Arizona-Mexico border. Rachel had recorded weather conditions, vehicle checkpoints, and encounters with suspected illegal border crossings, with the thoroughness of a dedicated law enforcement professional. However, as Dana progressed through the pages, subtle changes in tone and content began to emerge, suggesting that Rachel had gradually uncovered something far more sinister than routine immigration violations. By April 1995, Rachel's entries had taken on a more cautious and coded quality. She began referring to certain individuals by initials rather than full names, and her observations included cryptic references to unusual patrol schedules and unexplained gaps in sector coverage. Dana recognized these patterns as classic signs of an agent conducting covert surveillance while maintaining plausible deniability. Rachel had clearly been operating under the assumption that her official communications might be monitored or compromised. One particular entry, dated April 22, 1995, sent a chill down Dana's spine. Rachel had documented observing a convoy of 3 unmarked vehicles traveling along a restricted access road during what should have been a routine night patrol. The vehicles bore no official markings but were escorted by Border Patrol units, creating an obvious contradiction that had triggered Rachel's investigative instincts. Her notes indicated that she had attempted to radio for clarification about the convoy, but had received vague and evasive responses from the communications center. Dana found herself leaning forward in her chair, her coffee growing cold as she became absorbed in Rachel's meticulous documentation. The evidence room around her seemed to fade away as she immersed herself in the world that Rachel had inhabited 15 years earlier. Each page revealed new layers of a conspiracy that reached deep into the heart of the Border Patrol organization, threatening to implicate individuals at the highest levels of authority. The journal entries from early May 1995 contained Rachel's most damning observations. She had documented systematic irregularities in prisoner processing procedures, noting that certain individuals apprehended during border crossings were being separated from the general population and processed through unofficial channels. These individuals, according to Rachel's careful observations, were never entered into standard detention databases and seemed to simply vanish from official records. Rachel's investigative methodology impressed Dana with its sophistication and attention to detail. The missing agent had cross-referenced duty rosters with incident reports, identifying patterns of personnel assignments that suggested deliberate coordination among corrupt officials. She had noted which supervisors were consistently present during suspicious activities, and which sectors experienced unusual gaps in standard surveillance protocols. The name that appeared most frequently in Rachel's suspicions was Commander Elias Beck. Rachel had documented Beck's presence at virtually every suspicious incident she had observed, noting his unusual interest in specific detainee processing procedures and his tendency to personally oversee operations that would normally be delegated to subordinate officers. Her entries revealed growing concern about Beck's behavior and his apparent efforts to limit Rachel's access to certain operational areas. Dana paused at a particularly detailed entry dated May 8, 1995, just 5 days before Rachel's disappearance. The passage described Rachel's discovery of financial irregularities in departmental budgets, specifically noting discrepancies in fuel allocations and equipment purchases that suggested systematic embezzlement. Rachel had noted that these financial anomalies coincided with increased activity along specific border sectors, where the mysterious convoys had been observed. The final entries in the journal carried an urgent, almost desperate quality that revealed Rachel's growing awareness of the danger she faced. Her handwriting became more hurried, and her observations included references to feeling watched and followed during off-duty hours. She had documented instances where her vehicle had been searched without authorization, and her personal locker had been accessed by unknown individuals. Most chilling of all was Rachel's final entry, dated May 12, 1995, the day before her disappearance. She had written about her decision to compile all her evidence into a comprehensive report that would be submitted directly to the FBI's Internal Affairs Division, bypassing her Border Patrol chain of command entirely. The entry revealed her awareness that she was taking an enormous risk, but also her determination to expose the corruption she had uncovered, regardless of the personal consequences. Dana closed the journal and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing with the implications of what she had read. The systematic nature of the corruption Rachel had documented suggested an operation of significant scope and sophistication, one that would have required coordination among multiple agencies and levels of government. The fact that such an operation could continue undetected for years indicated the involvement of individuals with substantial power and influence. The evidence room's security cameras recorded Dana's every movement as she carefully photographed each page of the journal, ensuring that digital copies would be preserved for future analysis. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but her mind remained focused on the broader implications of Rachel's discoveries. The missing agent had clearly been closer to exposing a major criminal conspiracy than anyone had realized, making her disappearance all the more suspicious. Dana began cross-referencing Rachel's observations with official Border Patrol records from 1995, searching for corroborating evidence that might support the journal's allegations. The process proved frustratingly difficult, as many of the relevant files had been archived or reclassified over the intervening years. However, she managed to locate duty rosters and incident reports that confirmed several of Rachel's documented observations, lending credibility to her more serious accusations. The financial records proved particularly interesting. Dana's analysis revealed patterns of expenditure that aligned with Rachel's suspicions about embezzlement and misappropriation of funds. Equipment purchases and fuel allocations showed irregularities that would be difficult to explain through normal operational requirements, suggesting systematic diversion of resources for unauthorized purposes. As Dana delved deeper into the archived records, she began to understand the scope of the cover-up that had followed Rachel's disappearance. Official reports had been altered, witness statements had been suppressed, and physical evidence had been systematically destroyed or misclassified. The level of coordination required for such an extensive cover-up indicated involvement by individuals with access to the highest levels of law enforcement authority. Commander Beck's personnel file revealed a pattern of rapid promotions and commendations that seemed inconsistent with his actual performance record. Dana noticed that several of his career advancements had coincided with the resolution of potentially embarrassing incidents, suggesting that his rise through the ranks might have been facilitated by his willingness to protect powerful interests rather than his dedication to law enforcement principles. The weight of Rachel's sacrifice began to settle heavily on Dana's shoulders as she contemplated the courage required to investigate such powerful adversaries. Rachel had knowingly placed herself in extreme danger to expose corruption that threatened the integrity of the entire border security system. Her dedication to justice had ultimately cost her life, but her careful documentation had preserved the evidence necessary to finally bring her killers to justice. Dana found herself working late into the evening, driven by a sense of urgency that she couldn't fully explain. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she continued her analysis, searching for additional connections between Rachel's observations and the official records that remained available for review. Each new piece of evidence strengthened her conviction that Rachel had died protecting a secret that powerful people would kill to keep hidden. The Phoenix Department of Motor Vehicles office buzzed with the mundane chaos of bureaucratic efficiency, fluorescent lights casting their harsh glare over rows of plastic chairs and worn linoleum floors. Among the clerks processing endless stacks of paperwork sat Calvin Harris, a man whose once proud shoulders had curved inward over 15 years of carrying an unbearable secret. His graying hair, thin and retreating from a forehead marked by deep worry lines, caught the artificial light as he mechanically stamped documents with the repetitive precision of someone who had found refuge in mindless routine. Dana Sutton observed Harris from across the DMV lobby, studying the man who had once supervised Rachel Cooper during her final months as a Border Patrol agent. The transformation from the confident field supervisor described in personnel files to this hollow-eyed bureaucrat was stark and telling. Harris moved with the careful, measured gestures of someone perpetually aware of being watched, his eyes darting nervously toward windows and doorways as if expecting unwelcome visitors at any moment. At precisely 5:17 p.m., Harris gathered his belongings with practiced efficiency, his movements betraying the paranoid habits developed over years of looking over his shoulder. His lunchbox, a battered blue metal container that had seen better decades, went into a worn canvas messenger bag along with a thermos that had never quite managed to keep coffee hot enough. Dana watched as he checked his watch 3 times before finally standing, his knees creaking audibly in the relative quiet of the closing office. The parking lot outside the DMV building was nearly empty, shadows growing long in the early evening light that painted everything in shades of amber and gold. Harris walked to his vehicle, a faded red Honda Civic with over 200,000 miles on the odometer, its paint oxidized by years of Arizona sun. The car sat low on worn suspension, and Harris had to jiggle the driver's side handle twice before the door would open, a ritual he had clearly performed thousands of times. Dana approached as Harris was fumbling with his keys, his hands shaking slightly from what appeared to be a combination of caffeine withdrawal and chronic anxiety. His startled response when she called his name revealed the depth of his psychological fragmentation. The man who turned to face her bore little resemblance to the confident supervisor who had once led Border Patrol operations. His eyes, once sharp and commanding according to his service records, now held the haunted quality of someone who had witnessed terrible things and been forced to remain silent about them. Harris's immediate instinct was flight. His body language screamed of barely controlled panic as he recognized that someone had found him, someone who knew his real name and his connection to a past he had spent 15 years trying to escape. His breathing became shallow and rapid, and perspiration began to bead on his forehead despite the relatively cool evening temperature. The keys in his hand rattled as his trembling intensified, the sound unnaturally loud in the parking lot silence. Dana remained at a carefully calculated distance, her posture non-threatening but authoritative enough to command attention. She had spent years learning to read the subtle signs of trauma and guilt, and Harris displayed classic symptoms of someone carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. His constant glancing toward potential escape routes, his defensive body positioning, and his inability to maintain eye contact all suggested a man living in perpetual fear of consequences for past actions. The revelation that Dana was a DOJ investigator seemed to physically deflate Harris. His shoulders sagged as if an enormous weight had suddenly been placed upon them, and his face cycled through expressions of recognition, terror, and resignation in rapid succession. He leaned heavily against his car for support, one hand pressed against his chest, as if trying to calm a racing heart that had been beating irregularly for 15 years. Harris's apartment complex was a testament to the kind of anonymous living that people choose when they want to disappear without actually leaving town. The Sunrise Gardens complex had seen better decades, its stucco walls stained by years of monsoon rains and desert dust. The swimming pool had been drained sometime in the previous century, and the promised gardens consisted mainly of struggling palm trees and patches of gravel, where grass had long since given up trying to grow. Unit 23B sat at the end of a dimly lit hallway that smelled of cleaning chemicals and the accumulated cooking odors of dozens of residents who had given up caring about much of anything. Harris's door bore no personal touches, no nameplate or decorations that might help someone identify the occupant. Even his doormat was generic beige, the kind purchased from discount stores by people who had no interest in making a statement about their personal taste or lifestyle. The interior of Harris's apartment revealed a man who had been slowly disappearing for years. The furnishings were sparse and impersonal, consisting mainly of items that could be quickly abandoned if the need arose. A single recliner faced a small television, surrounded by towers of paperwork and empty coffee cups that suggested long nights spent staring at nothing in particular. The kitchen contained only the bare essentials, and the refrigerator held little more than expired condiments and microwave dinners. Harris moved through his apartment with the mechanical precision of someone following a routine designed to minimize thought and decision-making. He hung his jacket on a specific hook, placed his keys in a small bowl by the door, and immediately began brewing coffee with the desperate urgency of someone dependent on caffeine to function. His hands continued to shake as he measured grounds and added water, the familiar ritual providing a small measure of comfort in an otherwise terrifying situation. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the silence with the only sound Harris seemed comfortable with. He stood watching the machine work, his back to Dana, gathering what remained of his courage for the conversation he had dreaded for 15 years. The aroma of brewing coffee began to fill the small space, but even this simple pleasure seemed tainted by the weight of the secrets he carried. When Harris finally turned to face Dana, his transformation was complete. The frightened bureaucrat had been replaced by a man on the verge of total psychological collapse. His face had taken on the grayish pallor of someone confronting their worst fears, and his breathing had become labored as if the simple act of existing required enormous effort. 15 years of suppressed guilt and terror were written in every line of his weathered features. Dana produced Rachel's journal with deliberate ceremony, placing it on the small dining table that served as the apartment's main furniture. The leather-bound notebook seemed to radiate significance in the cramped space, its presence transforming the mundane apartment into a confessional booth where truth would finally be spoken. Harris stared at the journal as if it were a venomous snake, his entire body tensing at the sight of tangible evidence from the past he had tried so desperately to escape. The first page Dana opened contained one of Rachel's observations about Harris himself, dated just 3 days before her disappearance. Rachel had written about her growing concern for her supervisor's increasingly erratic behavior, and his reluctance to approve certain patrol requests. The handwriting was unmistakably Rachel's, and seeing it again after 15 years caused Harris to emit a sound somewhere between a sob and a gasp of recognition. Page after page revealed the extent of Rachel's investigation, and with each revelation, Harris seemed to shrink further into himself. His coffee grew cold as he stared at evidence that proved Rachel had been far closer to uncovering the truth than he had realized at the time. The careful documentation of corruption, the meticulous notes about suspicious activities, and the growing list of questions about Commander Beck's involvement painted a picture of an agent who had been systematically gathering evidence for a case that would have destroyed dozens of careers and sent numerous officials to prison. When Dana reached the pages detailing Rachel's plans to bypass the Border Patrol chain of command and report directly to federal authorities, Harris finally broke. The careful composure he had maintained for 15 years crumbled like ancient parchment, and the story he had carried in silence for so long began to pour out in a torrent of confession and regret. Harris revealed how Commander Beck had summoned him to a private meeting just hours after Rachel's disappearance was reported. The meeting had taken place in Beck's office after normal business hours, with the blinds drawn and the door locked against interruption. Beck had made it clear that Harris's cooperation in covering up Rachel's investigation was not optional, and that failure to comply would result in consequences that extended far beyond his career. The falsification of records had been extensive and systematic. Harris had been forced to alter patrol logs, modify duty rosters, and create false documentation suggesting that Rachel had been exhibiting signs of psychological instability and potential desertion for weeks before her disappearance. The paperwork had been meticulously crafted to support the official narrative, while eliminating any trace of Rachel's investigation into the trafficking operation. Harris described the crushing weight of participating in the cover-up, explaining how each falsified document and altered record had felt like another nail in Rachel's coffin. He had known that his actions were destroying the reputation of a dedicated agent while protecting the criminals responsible for her death. But Beck's threats had been both specific and credible. The trafficking operation involved individuals with connections to Mexican cartels and corrupt politicians who had demonstrated their willingness to eliminate threats through violence. The scope of the corruption had been staggering. Harris revealed that the trafficking operation had been generating millions of dollars in revenue through the systematic exploitation of illegal immigrants, with profits being shared among corrupt Border Patrol officials, local politicians, and cartel representatives. The operation had been so well organized and protected that it had continued virtually unimpeded for years after Rachel's death, with new recruits being carefully screened to ensure their silence and compliance. As Harris concluded his confession, the weight of 15 years of suppressed guilt seemed to physically manifest in his collapsed posture and exhausted expression. The apartment around him felt smaller somehow, as if the walls were closing in under the pressure of finally spoken truths. Outside, the sun had set completely, leaving only the harsh fluorescent light from the kitchen to illuminate a scene of psychological devastation and moral reckoning that would forever change both their lives. The coffee shop on the outskirts of Tucson hummed with the quiet energy of early morning commuters, its windows fogged with condensation from the contrast between the air-conditioned interior and the already warming Arizona air. Dana Sutton arrived first, choosing a corner booth with clear sightlines to all entrances, her paranoia sharpened by Calvin Harris's revelations about the reach and ruthlessness of Commander Beck's criminal network. She nursed a cup of black coffee that had grown cold while she waited, her fingers drumming nervously against the ceramic mug as she watched every patron who entered the establishment. David Cooper appeared exactly on time, his resemblance to his missing sister immediately apparent despite the 15 years that had aged and hardened his features. He moved with the controlled precision of someone who had learned to channel grief into purpose, his dark eyes scanning the room with the same investigative instincts that had once made Rachel such an effective agent. The weight of loss had carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth, but beneath the sorrow burned an intensity that Dana recognized as potentially dangerous if not properly directed. David's physical presence commanded attention even in civilian clothes. Standing just over 6 feet tall with the lean, muscular build of someone who maintained rigorous physical fitness as a form of emotional outlet, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had spent years in law enforcement before Rachel's disappearance had driven him to abandon his career in frustrated disgust with the system's failures. His hands, Dana noticed, showed the calluses and small scars of someone who worked with tools and machinery, suggesting that he had found refuge in manual labor during the dark years following his sister's vanishing. The meeting between Dana and David was initially tense, marked by David's barely contained rage at the revelations about his sister's fate, and his burning desire for immediate retribution against those responsible. His jaw clenched repeatedly as Dana explained the evidence from Rachel's journal and Harris's confession, his knuckles whitening as his hands formed involuntary fists. The controlled fury radiating from him was palpable, filling the small booth with an electric tension that made nearby patrons unconsciously shift away from their table. Dana's careful explanation of the legal complexities involved in building a case against Commander Beck gradually began to penetrate David's initial bloodlust. She outlined the challenges of prosecuting a decorated law enforcement official with powerful connections, emphasizing the need for overwhelming evidence that would survive scrutiny from the best defense attorneys money could buy. David's anger slowly transformed into focused determination as he began to understand that revenge served cold through the legal system would be far more satisfying and permanent than any immediate act of violence. The abandoned Border Patrol checkpoint that Calvin Harris had identified as Beck's operational base sat 23 miles southeast of Nogales, connected to the main highway by a dirt road that had deteriorated significantly since the facility's closure in 1998. The checkpoint had been decommissioned as part of budget cuts and operational consolidation, but its remote location and existing infrastructure made it perfect for clandestine activities. Dana and David had spent hours studying satellite imagery and topographical maps, planning their nighttime reconnaissance with the meticulous attention to detail that both their backgrounds demanded. Their first surveillance visit occurred during a new moon, providing maximum darkness for their approach. David's pickup truck, its engine muffled by aftermarket modifications he had installed for hunting expeditions, carried them along back roads and ranch access routes that avoided the main thoroughfares, where Border Patrol units might observe their passage. The desert landscape stretched endlessly around them, illuminated only by starlight and the occasional distant glow of ranch buildings scattered across the vast emptiness. The checkpoint facility appeared deserted from their initial observation point, a low rise approximately half a mile from the main buildings. Through military-grade binoculars borrowed from David's hunting equipment, they could see the concrete structures that had once housed administrative offices and detention facilities. The buildings showed obvious signs of recent use despite their officially abandoned status, with vehicle tracks in the surrounding dirt and evidence of electrical power being supplied through unauthorized connections to nearby transmission lines. Dana felt her heart rate accelerate as they crept closer to the facility, every shadow potentially concealing armed guards or surveillance equipment. Her breathing became shallow and controlled, a response developed during years of high-stakes investigations where discovery could mean death. The weight of her service pistol provided minimal comfort against the possibility that they might encounter Beck's associates, men who had already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to protect their operation. The main administrative building yielded the most significant evidence. Using lockpicking skills learned during her federal training, Dana managed to gain entry through a rear door that had been reinforced with additional deadbolts, suggesting regular use by people concerned about security. The interior had been modified extensively, with the original office spaces converted into holding cells equipped with heavy chains and locks designed to restrain human beings against their will. The smell hit them first, a combination of human waste, fear, and desperation that had soaked into the concrete walls over years of use. David's face went pale as the reality of what had occurred in these rooms became undeniable. Scattered on the floor were personal belongings that told the story of countless victims. Children's shoes, women's jewelry, photographs of families that would never be reunited. Each item represented a life destroyed by the greed and cruelty of Beck's trafficking operation. In what had once been the checkpoint commander's office, they discovered a metal filing cabinet that Beck had been careless enough to leave unlocked. Inside were financial records documenting payments to corrupt officials, transportation schedules coordinating with cartel representatives, and most damning of all, a ledger recording the sale of human beings like livestock. The clinical precision of the record-keeping revealed the systematic nature of the operation and provided concrete evidence of the scope of Beck's criminal enterprise. A small room adjacent to the main office contained evidence that made Dana's blood run cold. Personal effects that clearly belonged to Border Patrol agents were stored in plastic bags with dates and names, creating a macabre collection of trophies from victims who had gotten too close to the truth. Among these items, David identified a small silver cross that had belonged to Rachel, a gift from their grandmother that she had worn every day since childhood. The discovery of Rachel's cross transformed David's controlled anger into something far more dangerous. His hands shook as he held the familiar piece of jewelry, and Dana could see him struggling against the overwhelming urge to abandon their careful investigation in favor of immediate violent retribution. The physical evidence of his sister's fate, combined with the obvious implications about her final moments, pushed him to the edge of his psychological endurance. Their systematic documentation of the evidence took nearly 4 hours, with Dana photographing every document and David carefully cataloging physical evidence that could later be recovered through official channels. The work was emotionally exhausting, requiring them to maintain professional detachment while processing the horror of what they were uncovering. By the time they finished, both were physically and mentally drained from the weight of their discoveries. The drive back to town was conducted in tense silence, both lost in their own thoughts about the implications of what they had found. Dana's mind raced through the legal challenges of introducing evidence obtained through illegal search, while David struggled with images of his sister's final hours and the knowledge that her killers had continued their crimes for 15 years without consequence. 3 days after their reconnaissance mission, David's house was invaded with surgical precision. The attackers had clearly studied his routines and security measures, timing their assault for the narrow window when David typically showered after returning from his evening job at a local auto repair shop. They gained entry through his back door using professional locksmith tools, moving through his modest home with the confidence of people familiar with such operations. David's first indication of trouble was the sound of his bedroom door being kicked in while he stood dripping wet in his bathroom. 3 masked figures rushed him before he could react, their movements coordinated with military precision. The beating that followed was methodical and professional, designed to cause maximum pain and psychological impact while avoiding injuries that might prove fatal. They worked in silence except for the sound of fists and boots connecting with flesh, their message delivered through violence rather than words. The attackers left David conscious but badly injured, sprawled on his bathroom floor surrounded by evidence of their brutal efficiency. His face was swollen beyond easy recognition, 3 ribs were cracked, and his left shoulder had been dislocated with clinical precision. But the most terrifying aspect of the assault was its calculated restraint. These men could easily have killed him but had chosen not to, making it clear that his life continued at their sufferance. The message they left behind was simple but unmistakable. A single photograph of Dana entering the abandoned checkpoint, proving that their investigation had been observed, and that Beck's network possessed surveillance capabilities they had not anticipated. The photograph was placed carefully on David's kitchen table, where he would find it after dragging himself from the bathroom, a clear indication that they could strike at any target they chose. Despite his injuries and the obvious threat to their safety, David's resolve only strengthened in the aftermath of the attack. The physical pain paled compared to his determination to see justice done for Rachel and the countless other victims whose lives had been destroyed by Beck's operation. He refused medical treatment that would create official records of the assault, instead treating his injuries with supplies from a first aid kit while planning their next move. Dana's reaction to the attack was a mixture of guilt at having exposed David to danger and renewed determination to see the investigation through to its conclusion. She recognized that Beck's decision to resort to violence indicated desperation, suggesting that their investigation was causing serious concern within his organization. Rather than retreat, she began planning a more aggressive approach that would force Beck into making mistakes that could be used against him in court. Their plan began to take shape during long strategy sessions in David's garage, surrounded by automotive tools and equipment that provided both cover for their conversations and potential weapons if they were discovered. They would use Beck's obvious surveillance capabilities against him, creating situations where his responses would provide additional evidence of his guilt, while simultaneously building toward a confrontation that would force him to reveal the full extent of his criminal network. The abandoned Border Patrol checkpoint sat motionless in the pre-dawn darkness, its concrete structures casting geometric shadows across the desert floor like ancient monuments to forgotten conflicts. The air hung still and heavy, carrying the scent of creosote and dust that had settled over decades of disuse, while overhead, a canopy of stars provided the only illumination in the vast emptiness of the Arizona borderlands. In this desolate theater, Dana Sutton and her carefully assembled DOJ tactical team prepared for what would become the most crucial operation of their careers. Dana crouched behind a concrete barrier that had once served as vehicle inspection cover, her tactical vest pressing against her ribs with each controlled breath. The weight of her service weapon felt both familiar and foreign in the holster at her hip, a reminder that this night might require her to use deadly force against a man who had corrupted everything she believed about justice and law enforcement. Her earpiece crackled softly with periodic status updates from team members positioned around the perimeter, their voices barely audible whispers in the desert silence. Agent Marcus Rodriguez, the tactical team leader, occupied a sniper position atop the main administrative building, his rifle scope providing thermal imaging that could detect approaching vehicles from over a mile away. His breathing was steady and measured, years of specialized training evident in his absolute stillness as he maintained overwatch on the operation. The infrared scope revealed the heat signatures of his colleagues positioned throughout the compound, each agent a carefully placed piece in the tactical puzzle that would soon close around Commander Elias Beck. Special Agent Sarah Chen monitored electronic communications from a mobile command post disguised as a utility maintenance truck, her banks of surveillance equipment tracking Beck's cell phone signals and intercepting radio transmissions that might indicate he was bringing backup or had detected their operation. The truck's interior glowed with the soft blue light of multiple screens displaying real-time data streams, satellite imagery, and communication intercepts that painted a comprehensive picture of the tactical environment. David Cooper waited in the shadows near the facility's rear entrance, his face still bearing the purple and yellow bruises from his recent beating, the swelling around his left eye having subsided just enough to allow him partial vision. His presence at the operation was technically unauthorized, but Dana had recognized that his emotional investment in seeing Beck captured might prove crucial to breaking the commander's anticipated resistance. The pain from his cracked ribs provided a constant reminder of the stakes involved and the dangerous men they were confronting. The bait that would draw Beck to his capture had been carefully crafted through Calvin Harris's reluctant cooperation. Harris had contacted Beck earlier that evening, his voice shaking with what Beck would interpret as fear, rather than the crushing guilt that actually motivated his betrayal. The message had been simple. New evidence had surfaced that could link Beck directly to Rachel's disappearance, and Harris needed to meet at the checkpoint to ensure their stories remained aligned before federal investigators could piece together the truth. Beck's response to Harris's summons had been swift and decisive, confirming Dana's assessment that the commander's paranoia and need for control would compel him to personally handle any threat to his carefully constructed cover-up. The fact that Beck had agreed to meet at the checkpoint rather than insisting on a more secure location suggested either overconfidence in his ability to control the situation or desperation that was clouding his normally calculating judgment. At 2:47 a.m., Rodriguez's voice crackled through the team's communication system, announcing the approach of a single vehicle traveling without headlights along the access road. Dana's pulse quickened as she pressed herself lower behind the concrete barrier, her muscles tensing with the anticipation of imminent action. The sound of the approaching engine grew steadily louder, punctuated by the crunch of tires on gravel, and the occasional scrape of undercarriage against rocks that Beck had failed to navigate around in the darkness. The vehicle that emerged from the desert gloom was Beck's personal pickup truck, a black Ford F-150 with tinted windows and aftermarket modifications that included reinforced bumpers and a winch system that suggested frequent off-road use. Beck had clearly chosen this vehicle for its ability to navigate the rough terrain around the checkpoint, but also for its capacity to transport equipment or other cargo that might be necessary for what he believed would be evidence destruction rather than his own capture. Beck parked his truck approximately 30 yards from the main building, positioning it to provide quick escape routes in multiple directions while maintaining clear sight lines to detect potential threats. He sat motionless behind the wheel for nearly 5 minutes, scanning the facility through binoculars and listening for any sounds that might indicate the presence of unwelcome observers. His paranoia was evident in these precautionary measures, but 15 years of criminal success had made him methodical rather than reckless in his approach to potentially dangerous situations. When Beck finally exited his vehicle, Dana could see him clearly for the first time in the operation. The commander who had once projected authority and competence now moved with the nervous energy of a man under enormous psychological pressure. His uniform was impeccable as always, but his posture betrayed the strain of maintaining his facade while knowing that his criminal empire was beginning to crumble around him. The confidence that had intimidated subordinates and impressed superiors for decades had been replaced by the cautious movements of a predator who suspected he might have become the prey. Beck approached the checkpoint's main entrance with his service weapon drawn but held in a low ready position, his training evident in the tactical movement techniques he employed while advancing through potentially hostile territory. Each step was carefully placed to minimize noise, and his head constantly swiveled to scan for threats or signs of ambush. The desert silence seemed to amplify every sound he made, from the soft scrape of his boots on gravel to the whisper of fabric as his uniform shifted with each movement. The moment Beck stepped across the threshold into the main building, Dana's team moved with the precision of a well-rehearsed ballet. Rodriguez maintained his overwatch position, while agents emerged from concealment points throughout the facility, their movements coordinated through hand signals and pre-planned positions that gave them overwhelming tactical advantage. The element of surprise was complete, leaving Beck no time to react before finding himself surrounded by federal agents with weapons trained on his center mass. Beck's initial response was one of shocked disbelief rather than resistance. His service weapon fell from nerveless fingers as the reality of his situation penetrated the arrogance that had sustained him through years of criminal activity. The confident commander who had terrorized subordinates and orchestrated the deaths of those who threatened his operation was suddenly reduced to a frightened man, facing the collapse of everything he had built through corruption and violence. The arrest was conducted with clinical efficiency, with Beck's hands secured behind his back with federal restraints, while Agent Chen read him his Miranda rights in a voice that carried no emotion or satisfaction. The commander who had once held life-and-death authority over the border region now found himself powerless, his career and freedom forfeit to the justice system he had so thoroughly corrupted. His uniform, still bearing the insignia of his rank and authority, seemed to mock his current circumstances. Despite the overwhelming evidence of his presence at the scene and his obvious guilt, Beck initially maintained his innocence with the stubborn defiance of a man accustomed to having his authority respected without question. His denials were delivered with the same commanding tone he had once used to intimidate subordinates. But the effect was hollow when delivered from a position of complete powerlessness. Dana recognized the behavior as the psychological defense mechanism of someone whose entire identity had been built around dominance and control. Beck's confidence began to waver as Dana systematically presented the evidence they had gathered against him. Rachel's journal, Harris's confession, the financial records from the checkpoint facility, and the physical evidence they had documented all combined to paint an inescapable picture of his criminal activities. Each piece of evidence seemed to physically diminish Beck, his posture becoming more defensive as he realized the scope of the case being built against him. The psychological breakthrough came when David Cooper stepped forward, his bruised and battered face providing stark testimony to Beck's ruthlessness and the personal cost of seeking justice. The sight of David's injuries seemed to trigger something in Beck's psychology, perhaps recognition of the futility of continued denial, or simply the weight of years of suppressed guilt finally overwhelming his defenses. His arrogant facade cracked like desert hardpan under sudden rainfall. Beck's confession emerged not as a proud admission of power, but as the bitter acknowledgement of a man who had sacrificed everything meaningful for temporary control and financial gain. His voice, once commanding and authoritative, became hollow and defeated as he described how Rachel's investigation had threatened to expose not just his trafficking operation, but the entire network of corruption that had made his crimes possible. The murder had been committed in a moment of panic when Rachel had confronted him with evidence that would have destroyed dozens of careers and sent multiple officials to federal prison. The details of Rachel's final moments were delivered with clinical detachment, as if Beck were reporting on someone else's crimes rather than confessing to murder. He described how he had lured Rachel to a remote location under the pretense of discussing her concerns about operational irregularities, then killed her when she refused to abandon her investigation. The murder weapon, a throwaway pistol purchased through illegal channels, had been disposed of in the Colorado River, along with any physical evidence that might have connected him to the crime. Most chilling of all was Beck's admission that Rachel's body had been dissolved in acid at a remote location in the desert, ensuring that no physical evidence of his crime would ever surface to corroborate the accusations against him. The methodical nature of the body's disposal revealed the calculating mind of someone who had planned for every contingency except the possibility that Rachel's own documentation would eventually surface to expose his crimes. As Beck's confession concluded, the desert around them seemed to exhale with relief, as if the land itself had been holding its breath for 15 years, waiting for this moment of reckoning. The tactical team maintained their professional composure, but Dana could see in their faces the same mixture of satisfaction and revulsion that she felt at finally hearing the truth about Rachel Cooper's fate. Justice had been a long time coming, but it had finally arrived in the place where Rachel had last walked as a living person. The fluorescent lights of the DOJ field office burned through the early morning hours, casting harsh shadows across walls covered with evidence boards, satellite maps, and forensic photographs that documented 15 years of systematic corruption and murder. Dana Sutton stood before the central evidence board, her eyes tracing the complex web of connections that linked Commander Elias Beck to Rachel Cooper's disappearance, while her mind wrestled with the frustrating gap between Beck's confession and the physical evidence needed to secure his conviction in federal court. Beck's admission of guilt had provided the psychological satisfaction of finally knowing Rachel's fate, but experienced prosecutors had warned Dana that confessions alone were often insufficient to overcome the aggressive defense strategies employed by attorneys representing high-profile defendants. The legal system demanded corroborating evidence, physical proof that would transform Beck's words from the desperate lies of a cornered criminal into the documented truth that would ensure justice for Rachel and her family. The search for Rachel's remains had begun immediately following Beck's arrest, with teams of federal agents and forensic specialists deployed to every location mentioned in his rambling confession. The Colorado River had been systematically searched using sonar equipment and underwater cameras, while teams with metal detectors had scoured miles of desert terrain, looking for any trace of the murder weapon or other physical evidence that might support the commander's claims about the disposal of evidence. Agent Sarah Chen coordinated the massive search operation from a command post established in a converted recreational vehicle that followed the search teams across the harsh terrain of southern Arizona. Banks of communication equipment maintained contact with multiple search units simultaneously, while computers processed real-time data from ground-penetrating radar units and other specialized equipment designed to locate buried objects or disturbed earth that might indicate grave sites. The frustration of the search teams was palpable as days passed without significant discoveries. Beck's confession had been deliberately vague about specific locations, forcing investigators to search vast areas of desert based on his cryptic references to landmarks that might have changed significantly over 15 years. The commander's claims about dissolving Rachel's body in acid had initially led investigators to focus on chemical disposal sites and industrial facilities. But these searches had yielded nothing but contaminated soil and rusted equipment. David Cooper had refused to remain passive during the official search, instead pursuing his own investigation into Beck's activities during the crucial days surrounding Rachel's disappearance. His approach was more direct and personal than the methodical federal investigation, driven by a brother's desperate need to find his sister's remains and provide her with the burial she deserved after 15 years of uncertainty and pain. David's investigation led him to retrace Beck's movements during the 72 hours following Rachel's last known sighting, using his own law enforcement background to identify potential witnesses and locations that might have escaped official attention. His efforts were hampered by the passage of time and the natural reluctance of potential witnesses to cooperate with unofficial investigations, but his persistence eventually uncovered a crucial piece of evidence that had been overlooked by the federal teams. The Desert Stop convenience store sat at the intersection of two remote highways, serving travelers and local residents with basic supplies, fuel, and the kind of anonymity that made it popular with people conducting business they preferred to keep private. The store's exterior was weathered by decades of desert sun and sandstorms, its faded paint and rusted signs giving it the appearance of a business that had been forgotten by time and progress. The store's current owner, Maria Gonzalez, had inherited the business from her uncle 5 years earlier, along with boxes of old records and equipment that she had never bothered to examine thoroughly. David's inquiry about security cameras from 1995 had initially been met with skeptical laughter, but Maria's curiosity had been piqued enough for her to search through the dusty storage room behind the main counter. Hidden beneath layers of invoices and tax records, Maria discovered a cardboard box containing dozens of VHS tapes labeled with dates spanning several years in the mid-1990s. The tapes had been recorded by a primitive security system that her uncle had installed after a series of robberies, but the system had been abandoned when digital technology made the old equipment obsolete. The tapes had been preserved by accident rather than design, stored in the dry environment of the desert storage room where they had remained undisturbed for decades. David's hands shook with anticipation as he loaded the tape labeled May 13, 1995 into an old VHS player that Maria had retrieved from her uncle's personal effects. The video quality was poor, with timestamps that flickered and image resolution that made identification challenging, but the camera's position provided a clear view of the store's main entrance and the adjacent parking area where customers typically parked while making purchases. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m., when a familiar figure appeared on the grainy recording. Commander Elias Beck, wearing civilian clothes, but still maintaining the rigid posture that marked him as military or law enforcement, approached the store entrance with the purposeful stride of someone conducting urgent business. His face was clearly visible under the harsh fluorescent lighting of the store's exterior, providing irrefutable identification that placed him at the location during the crucial time period. Beck's purchases, captured by a second camera positioned behind the store counter, told a chilling story of premeditation and careful planning. The receipt, miraculously preserved in the store's primitive computerized system, documented the purchase of 4 bags of quick-setting concrete, heavy-duty garbage bags, industrial-strength bleach, and a set of work gloves. The combination of items could have innocent explanations individually, but taken together they painted a disturbing picture of someone preparing to conceal evidence of a serious crime. The security footage showed Beck loading his purchases into the back of his personal pickup truck, the same vehicle that had been identified in witness statements from the night of Rachel's disappearance. His movements were methodical and efficient, suggesting that he had planned the purchases in advance, rather than making impulsive decisions driven by panic or desperation. The clinical nature of his preparations revealed the calculating mind of someone who had considered every aspect of covering up his intended crime. Dana felt a chill of recognition as she watched the security footage in the Desert Stop's cramped office, her law enforcement experience allowing her to read the significance of Beck's body language and purchase selections. The commander's confident demeanor on the recording contrasted sharply with his eventual confession, suggesting that at the time of Rachel's murder, he had been certain that his crime would never be discovered or prosecuted. The concrete purchase proved to be the crucial clue that redirected the search for Rachel's remains. Instead of focusing on remote desert locations or chemical disposal sites, Dana's team began investigating construction projects and development sites that had been active during the relevant time period. The process was complicated by the rapid growth and development that had transformed much of southern Arizona over the intervening 15 years. But careful research into building permits and construction records eventually identified several promising locations. The abandoned construction site on the outskirts of Tucson had once been intended as a small shopping center, but economic downturns and permit problems had caused the developers to abandon the project after completing only the foundation work and basic infrastructure. The site had remained undisturbed for years, overgrown with desert vegetation and littered with construction debris that provided perfect camouflage for any evidence that might have been hidden there. Ground-penetrating radar scans of the construction site revealed several anomalies in the concrete foundations, areas where the density and composition of the material differed from the surrounding structures. These anomalies suggested that portions of the foundation had been poured at different times, or with different material compositions, potentially indicating locations where evidence might have been concealed within the concrete itself. The excavation process was painstaking and emotionally exhausting for everyone involved. Each section of concrete had to be carefully broken apart, using jackhammers and other heavy equipment, while forensic specialists examined every piece of debris for traces of biological material or other evidence. The work was conducted under portable lighting that turned the construction site into an otherworldly landscape of harsh shadows and blinding illumination. Dana stood at the edge of the excavation site as workers methodically demolished decades-old concrete, her heart racing with each piece of foundation that was removed and examined. The possibility that they might finally locate Rachel's remains filled her with a mixture of hope and dread, knowing that physical confirmation of the murder would provide closure for David and his family, while also confronting them with the brutal reality of Rachel's final moments. On the third day of excavation, a worker's jackhammer struck something that was clearly not concrete or rebar. The metallic ringing sound brought all activity to an immediate halt, as forensic specialists moved in to carefully expose what appeared to be a buried metal object. Using brushes and dental picks with archaeological precision, they gradually revealed the outline of a service weapon that had been wrapped in plastic and embedded in the concrete foundation. The pistol, despite 15 years of burial in concrete, had been preserved well enough for ballistics analysis and serial number identification. The weapon was immediately recognizable as a standard-issue Border Patrol service pistol, its distinctive markings and serial numbers clearly visible once the encrusting concrete had been carefully removed. Database searches quickly confirmed that the weapon had been issued to Commander Elias Beck during his early years with the Border Patrol, providing irrefutable physical evidence linking him to the crime scene. The discovery of Beck's service weapon energized the excavation team and led to even more intensive searching of the surrounding concrete. Additional anomalies detected by the ground-penetrating radar suggested that the weapon had not been the only item concealed within the foundation, and subsequent excavation revealed the presence of human remains that had been carefully wrapped and positioned before being covered with concrete. Rachel Cooper's remains, after 15 years of concealment, were finally recovered from their concrete tomb with the reverence and dignity that her sacrifice deserved. The forensic team worked with painstaking care to document every aspect of the recovery, photographing and cataloging each piece of evidence while maintaining the chain of custody that would be essential for successful prosecution. The physical evidence recovered from the construction site provided the final pieces of the puzzle that had consumed Dana's life for months. Beck's service weapon, forensic evidence from Rachel's remains, and the documented timeline of his activities on the night of the murder combined to create an overwhelming case that no defense attorney could successfully challenge. Justice for Rachel Cooper was no longer a matter of hope, but an inevitable conclusion supported by irrefutable proof. The federal courthouse in Phoenix stood like a monument to justice against the desert sky, its limestone facade gleaming in the harsh Arizona sunlight as crowds of reporters, federal agents, and curious onlookers gathered for what had become one of the most significant corruption trials in Border Patrol history. The building's imposing columns and marble steps seemed to promise the kind of institutional authority that Commander Elias Beck had spent decades corrupting. But today, those same symbols would serve as the backdrop for his final humiliation and downfall. Inside courtroom 4A, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation, as federal prosecutors presented their meticulously assembled case against the man who had once commanded respect and fear throughout the border security apparatus. Dana Sutton sat in the gallery's front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she watched the systematic dismantling of Beck's carefully constructed lies and denials. Each piece of evidence she had uncovered was presented with clinical precision, creating an unassailable narrative of corruption, murder, and cover-up that left no room for reasonable doubt. The prosecution's presentation was a masterpiece of forensic storytelling, beginning with Rachel Cooper's own words from her recovered journal and building through Calvin Harris's tearful testimony, the damning security footage from the Desert Stop convenience store, and finally the irrefutable physical evidence recovered from the construction site. Beck's defense attorneys, despite their considerable reputation and expertise, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer volume and quality of evidence that Dana's investigation had produced. Beck himself sat at the defense table like a man who had aged decades in the months since his arrest. The confident commander who had once terrorized subordinates and orchestrated the deaths of those who threatened his operation now appeared diminished and defeated, his expensive suit unable to conceal the psychological toll of facing justice after 15 years of impunity. His attempts to maintain dignity were undermined by the tremor in his hands and the way his eyes darted nervously around the courtroom, as if searching for escape routes that no longer existed. The moment of verdict arrived with all the weight of institutional justice finally asserting itself over individual corruption. The jury foreman, a retired teacher whose steady voice carried the authority of collective moral judgment, delivered the guilty verdicts on all counts with clinical precision that left no doubt about Beck's fate. Murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit human trafficking, obstruction of justice, and a dozen other charges that would ensure he would never again walk free to harm innocent people. Beck's sentencing hearing 2 weeks later drew an even larger crowd, including many of the families whose loved ones had disappeared into his trafficking operation over the years. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Morrison, delivered the life sentence with a solemnity that acknowledged both the severity of Beck's crimes and the long road to justice that had finally reached its conclusion. Her words about the sanctity of law enforcement and the particular betrayal represented by Beck's actions seemed to echo through the courtroom like a benediction for Rachel's memory. The media attention following Beck's conviction transformed Rachel Cooper from a forgotten footnote in Border Patrol history into a symbol of courage and dedication that inspired law enforcement officers across the country. News organizations that had ignored her disappearance 15 years earlier now competed to tell her story, describing her investigation and ultimate sacrifice in terms that elevated her to the pantheon of heroes who had died protecting others from corruption and violence. Dana watched the media coverage from her apartment, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion as Rachel's story finally received the attention it deserved. The vindication was deeply satisfying, but it came with the bitter knowledge that justice delayed was justice partially denied. 15 years during which Beck's operation had destroyed countless additional lives, while Rachel's family suffered the pain of not knowing her fate. The formal ceremony at Border Patrol headquarters to restore Rachel's reputation and honor her service was conducted with military precision and genuine emotion. Rachel's name was added to the memorial wall honoring agents who had died in the line of duty, while her family received the commendations and recognition that should have been hers 15 years earlier. David Cooper accepted the honors on his sister's behalf, his voice breaking with emotion as he thanked the agents who had finally brought her story to light. Dana's decision to leave the Department of Justice came not from dissatisfaction with the outcome of Rachel's case, but from a deep sense that her mission had been completed, and that continuing in federal service would feel anticlimactic after achieving such a significant victory for justice. Her resignation letter, submitted quietly without fanfare or explanation, simply stated her intention to pursue other opportunities that would allow her to continue fighting corruption in different ways. The processing of her departure from DOJ took several weeks, during which Dana found herself reflecting on the profound changes that investigating Rachel's case had wrought in her own life and worldview. The experience had reinforced her faith in the possibility of justice, while simultaneously revealing the depth of corruption that could exist within trusted institutions. She understood now that fighting such corruption required not just professional commitment, but personal courage that few people possessed. Desert View Memorial Cemetery stretched across gently rolling hills on the outskirts of Tucson, its carefully maintained grounds providing a peaceful contrast to the harsh beauty of the surrounding Sonoran Desert. The cemetery's mature trees offered welcome shade from the intense Arizona sun, while the distant mountains provided a backdrop that spoke to the eternal nature of the landscape that had claimed Rachel's life and eventually revealed the truth about her fate. Rachel's gravesite was located in a section reserved for law enforcement officers, marked by a simple granite headstone that bore her name, dates of service, and the inscription, "Courage Under Fire," that David had chosen to honor his sister's willingness to confront corruption regardless of personal risk. Fresh flowers adorned the grave, evidence of the regular visits from family members and fellow officers who had finally learned the truth about her sacrifice. Dana approached the gravesite on a clear morning in early autumn, carrying a small bouquet of desert wildflowers that she had gathered along the road leading to the cemetery. The flowers seemed appropriate somehow, their resilient beauty reflecting the strength that Rachel had shown in the face of overwhelming opposition and danger. The silence of the cemetery was broken only by the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant sound of traffic from the city below. Standing before Rachel's grave, Dana felt the weight of completion settling over her like a familiar blanket. The investigation that had consumed her life for months was finally finished. Justice had been served, and Rachel's family had the closure they deserved after 15 years of uncertainty and pain. The sense of accomplishment was profound, but it was tempered by awareness that Rachel's death represented just one victory in an ongoing war against corruption that would continue long after Dana had moved on to other battles. David Cooper's approach was quiet and unannounced, his presence becoming apparent only when Dana heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her. His face still bore faint traces of the bruises from his beating, but his expression carried a peace that had been absent during the intense months of investigation and trial. The anger that had driven him to seek justice for his sister had been replaced by a quiet satisfaction and gratitude that spoke to the healing power of truth finally revealed. The conversation between Dana and David was brief but profound, consisting mainly of acknowledgments of shared experience and mutual respect for the sacrifices that had brought them to this moment. David's gratitude was evident not just in his words, but in his entire bearing. The way he stood straighter and looked directly into Dana's eyes with the confidence of someone whose burden had finally been lifted by the actions of others who cared about justice. Dana's departure from the cemetery was conducted with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her investigation of Rachel's case. She walked slowly back to her car, taking time to appreciate the peaceful setting and the knowledge that Rachel was finally resting in a place of honor rather than hidden beneath concrete in an abandoned construction site. The contrast between Rachel's original fate and her final resting place seemed to symbolize the triumph of truth over deception that had defined the entire investigation. The drive away from Desert View Cemetery took Dana through streets and neighborhoods that had become familiar during her months of investigation. Past the DOJ field office where she had first examined Rachel's journal, the Desert Stop convenience store where crucial evidence had been discovered, and the construction site where Rachel's remains had finally been recovered. Each location held memories of the painstaking work that had been necessary to uncover the truth and achieve justice for a woman who had died protecting others. As Dana's car merged onto the interstate leading away from Tucson, she reflected on the broader implications of Rachel's case and the ongoing fight against corruption that would continue in other investigations, other courtrooms, and other communities where dedicated individuals refused to accept that powerful people could commit crimes with impunity. Rachel's legacy lived not just in the justice that had finally been achieved, but in the inspiration her courage provided to others who would face similar challenges in the future. The desert landscape stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway, its ancient beauty serving as a reminder that truth, like the land itself, was permanent and enduring while human corruption was temporary and ultimately powerless against those who possessed the courage to seek justice. Dana drove toward an uncertain future, but one enriched by the knowledge that her work had honored the memory of a fallen hero and demonstrated that even the most powerful criminals could not escape the consequences of their actions forever. We want to hear your opinion about this thrilling story. What do you think will happen with them? Tell us your name, where you are watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new stories coming up. See you next time.